Nathan Pierce had everything money could buy: a billion-dollar empire, a mansion in Connecticut, and the love of his 8-year-old son, Lucas. But in the shadow of Blue Moon Diner's flickering neon sign, surrounded by cracked vinyl booths and the smell of burnt coffee, his perfect world began to unravel. The leather wallet lay open on the scarred Formica table, revealing a faded photograph he'd never seen before. A young Latina woman with luminous dark eyes and a heartbreaking smile, hidden behind his late wife's picture like a carefully guarded secret. 3 months this stranger's face had haunted him, appearing in his wallet without explanation or memory. The morning light filtered through grease-stained windows as Maya Rodriguez approached, her waitress uniform wrinkled from a double shift, her hands trembling as she recognized something impossible. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice cracked like breaking glass. "Why is my mother's picture in your wallet?" Nathan's world tilted sideways as he stared at the young woman before him. Maya's features held an undeniable resemblance to the photograph. The same warm brown eyes, the same gentle curve of her smile, the same dark hair that caught the morning light streaming through the diner windows. He glanced down at the wallet, then back at her face, his mind struggling to make sense of what she'd just said. The photograph had appeared in his wallet like a ghost from someone else's past, and now that ghost was standing in front of him, asking questions he couldn't begin to answer. "Your mother?" Nathan managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. I've never seen this picture before 3 months ago, and I certainly don't know how it got into my wallet." He studied Maya's face more carefully, searching for any clue that might explain this impossible coincidence. "What was your mother's name?" Maya's hand shook as she set down the coffee pot, her professional composure cracking. "Esperanza Rodriguez. She disappeared 18 years ago when I was 8 years old. That photograph, it's the only one I have of her." Tears welled in her eyes as she pointed at the wallet. "But that's not a copy. That's the original. I'd recognize the small tear in the corner anywhere. How do you have my mother's picture?" The diner seemed to fade around them as Nathan processed her words. 18 years ago, he'd been 24, fresh out of college, and working late nights at his father's real estate company in Manhattan. Those were blurry years of ambition and exhaustion, of building the empire that would eventually make him a billionaire. But a Mexican woman named Esperanza Rodriguez? He searched his memory and came up empty. Yet something about Maya's presence felt achingly familiar. "I moved to Millbrook 2 years ago with my son after my wife Helen passed away," Nathan said slowly, still trying to piece together the puzzle. "This wallet was a gift from Helen on her last birthday. I never saw this photograph until recently, and I have no idea how it got there." He looked at Maya with genuine confusion and growing concern. "But if this really is your mother's picture, then we need to figure out how Helen came to have it." Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her vulnerability making her look younger than her 26 years. "My grandmother Carmen raised me after Mum disappeared. She always said Mum had died, but I never believed it. I've been searching for answers my whole life." She glanced around the diner, suddenly aware that other customers were starting to stare. "I work 3 jobs to pay for online nursing classes. I thought if I became a nurse like Mom wanted to be, maybe somehow I'd find a trace of her." Nathan felt something shift inside his chest, a protective instinct he'd only felt for Lucas. There was something about Maya's determination, her quiet strength in the face of loss, that reminded him of his own journey through grief. "Would you be willing to meet me after your shift? Maybe together we can figure out how our lives intersected." He closed the wallet carefully, the photograph now feeling like a bridge between 2 broken families. "I have resources that might help us find the truth about your mother." As Maya nodded and returned to her work, Nathan watched her move between tables with practiced grace, her resilience evident in every step. He thought about Lucas, asleep at home with the babysitter, and wondered what secrets Helen might have taken to her grave. The photograph in his wallet had just transformed from a mystery into a mission, and Nathan Pierce was a man who never walked away from a challenge. But as he left the diner that morning, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that finding the truth about Esperanza Rodriguez might change everything he thought he knew about his own life. Some secrets, he was beginning to realize, had the power to reshape not just the past, but the future as well. Nathan Pierce had built his fortune by solving complex problems, but the mystery of Esperanza Rodriguez was proving to be his most challenging puzzle yet. Over the past week, he'd hired the best private investigator in Connecticut and spent hours poring over Helen's personal belongings, searching for any clue that might explain how his late wife had come to possess Maya's mother's photograph. The investigation had already yielded disturbing preliminary results that made him question everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd loved. Lucas, his 8-year-old son, had noticed his father's preoccupation immediately. The boy had inherited Nathan's sharp intellect, along with his mother's intuitive nature, and he'd begun asking questions that Nathan wasn't ready to answer. How do you tell a child that the foundation of his world might be built on secrets? How do you explain that sometimes the people we love most are capable of choices that defy understanding? The private investigator, Marcus Webb, had delivered his first report that morning over coffee in Nathan's study. Esperanza Rodriguez had indeed worked in Manhattan 18 years ago, employed by a cleaning service that maintained several high-end office buildings. One of those buildings had housed Pierce Real Estate during Nathan's early years with the company. The timeline was correct, the location was correct, but Nathan's memory remained frustratingly blank. "Mr. Pierce, I have to ask," Webb had said, his expression carefully neutral. "Is it possible you had a personal relationship with Ms. Rodriguez that you've forgotten? The circumstances of her disappearance are unusual. She left behind an 8-year-old daughter and vanished without a trace. No forwarding address, no contact with family, nothing. That kind of disappearance usually indicates either foul play or someone running from something." Nathan had insisted that he would remember such a relationship, but even as he spoke the words, doubt had crept into his voice. Those years had been a whirlwind of 18-hour workdays and social obligations. He'd met Helen during that time, courted her, married her, and started planning their future together. Could there have been someone else? Someone whose memory had been buried beneath years of guilt and grief? Maya had agreed to meet him at a small park on the outskirts of Millbrook, away from the curious eyes of the diner's regular customers. She arrived precisely on time, still wearing her waitress uniform, but carrying herself with a dignity that spoke to her inner strength. Nathan had brought copies of the investigator's preliminary findings, hoping they might trigger some memory or provide a new lead. "I've been thinking about what you said," Maya began, as they sat on a weathered bench beneath an old oak tree. "About your wife having this photograph. My grandmother Carmen has been acting strange ever since I told her about meeting you. She keeps saying some secrets are better left buried. But I can't live with not knowing anymore." She turned to face Nathan, her dark eyes reflecting years of unanswered questions. "What if my mother didn't just disappear? What if something happened to her?" Nathan felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This young woman had been searching for her mother for 18 years, and somehow his family was connected to that search. He showed her the investigator's findings about the cleaning service and the timeline of her mother's employment. As Maya studied the documents, Nathan noticed her hands trembling slightly, the same tremor he'd observed when she'd first seen the photograph. "There's something else," Nathan said gently. "The investigator found records indicating that your mother was pregnant when she disappeared. The timing suggests she would have given birth around the same time Helen and I." He paused, the words sticking in his throat as an impossible thought began to form. "Maya, when is your birthday?" "March 15th, 2007. She replied, without hesitation. "Why?" Nathan's blood ran cold. Lucas had been born on March 15th, 2007. The coincidence was too perfect, too precise to be random. He thought about Lucas's features, the dark hair and brown eyes that he'd always attributed to Helen's grandmother, the olive skin tone that had seemed unusual but not impossible given Helen's Mediterranean ancestry. Suddenly, those features took on a different significance, a more troubling explanation. "Nathan, are you all right?" Maya's voice seemed to come from far away as the implications of the date crashed over him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, he had. Nathan stared at Maya's face and saw Lucas reflected there, not in the vague way of distant relatives, but in the unmistakable similarity of siblings. The photograph in his wallet wasn't just a random keepsake. It was evidence of a connection so profound and disturbing that his mind recoiled from accepting it. If his suspicions were correct, then everything he believed about his son, his marriage, and his own moral compass was about to shatter. "Maya," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I think we need to talk about more than just your mother's disappearance. I think we need to talk about your brother." The color drained from Maya's face as the meaning of his words sank in. In the distance, children played on swings while their parents watched from nearby benches, everyone blissfully unaware that two lives were about to change forever. Nathan reached for his wallet, his fingers trembling as he touched the photograph that had started this journey. Some truths, he was learning, had the power to destroy everything in their path. But as he looked at Maya's stunned expression, Nathan realized that destruction might be the only path to redemption. The truth about Esperanza Rodriguez was no longer just about solving a mystery. It was about saving two families from the consequences of secrets that should never have been kept. Over the following 2 weeks, Nathan and Maya had developed an unlikely friendship built on shared questions and mutual determination to uncover the truth. Maya worked her shifts at the diner with new purpose, knowing that Nathan would be waiting with updates from the investigation, or simply offering the kind of support she'd never had from anyone outside her grandmother. Nathan found himself looking forward to their meetings with an intensity that surprised him, drawn not just by the mystery, but by Maya's resilience and quiet strength. Lucas had begun asking about the nice lady from the restaurant, with the persistence only an 8-year-old could muster. Nathan had brought his son to the diner twice, ostensibly for breakfast, but really to observe the interaction between Lucas and Maya. What he'd witnessed had both warmed his heart and deepened his fears. Maya had a natural way with Lucas, anticipating his needs and responding to his moods with an intuition that seemed almost maternal. "She knows exactly how I like my pancakes," Lucas had announced after their second visit, his 8-year-old logic finding this fact tremendously important. And she didn't even have to ask about the syrup. Mom always had to remind the other waitresses, but Maya just knew. The casual comparison to Helen had hit Nathan like a physical blow, another piece of evidence supporting his growing suspicions. The private investigator had made a breakthrough, uncovering medical records from March 2007 that painted a disturbing picture. Esperanza Rodriguez had been admitted to Millbrook General Hospital on the night of March 14th, suffering from complications during labor. She'd given birth to a son in the early hours of March 15th, the same night that Helen had delivered Lucas at the same hospital. The coincidence was no longer coincidental. It was deliberate. Maya had insisted on accompanying Nathan to meet with Webb when he'd called with urgent news. They sat in the investigator's modest office, surrounded by filing cabinets and computer equipment that looked like it belonged in a detective movie. Webb's expression was grave as he spread out documents and photographs on his desk, each piece of evidence building toward a conclusion that none of them wanted to face. "I've found Helen Pierce's medical records from that night," Webb began, his voice carefully professional. "She was admitted to the same hospital as Esperanza Rodriguez, and she did give birth on March 15th. But according to the hospital records, Helen's baby was stillborn." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle before continuing. "There's no record of what happened to that baby, and Esperanza Rodriguez disappeared from the hospital that same night, leaving behind her newborn son." Maya's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob as the implications became clear. Nathan felt the room spin around him as Webb continued laying out the evidence: falsified birth certificates, altered medical records, and a trail of payments from Helen's personal account to individuals whose names appeared nowhere else in her financial history. The picture that emerged was of a carefully orchestrated plan to take Esperanza's healthy baby and replace Helen's lost child. "Your wife wasn't just a grieving mother who made a desperate choice," Webb said to Nathan. "These records suggest she planned this substitution weeks in advance. She knew Esperanza was pregnant, she knew when the baby was due, and she had people in place to make the switch." He pulled out a photograph of a young woman in hospital scrubs. "This is Sarah Chen, a nurse who worked the maternity ward that night. She left town immediately after and was never seen again. I believe she was paid to facilitate the exchange." Maya stood abruptly, pacing to the window as she struggled to process the information. "So my mother didn't abandon me," she said, her voice breaking. "She didn't choose to disappear. Someone stole her baby and forced her to run." She turned back to Nathan, tears streaming down her face. "Your wife stole my brother and destroyed my family." Nathan wanted to defend Helen's memory, to find some explanation that would make her actions understandable, if not forgivable. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his own memories were beginning to shift and clarify. He remembered Helen's strange behavior during her pregnancy, her insistence on using a specific hospital despite their insurance covering better facilities. He remembered her secretive phone calls and unexplained absences in the weeks leading up to Lucas's birth. "I'm going to find her," Maya said suddenly, her grief transforming into determination. "I'm going to find my mother and bring her home, and I'm going to tell Lucas the truth about who he really is." She looked at Nathan with eyes that held both compassion and accusation. He deserves to know his real family. Nathan felt his world tilting on its axis as he realized what Maya was suggesting. Lucas was the center of his universe, the reason he got up every morning, and the motivation behind every decision he made. The boy had lost his mother to cancer when he was 6. Learning that she hadn't been his biological mother at all might be more than his young mind could handle. But Nathan also understood Maya's position. She'd been searching for her family for 18 years, and now she'd found not just answers, but a brother. "Maya, please," Nathan said, rising from his chair to face her. "I know you have every right to be angry, and I know Lucas is your brother, but he's also been my son for 8 years. He doesn't remember Helen being sick, doesn't understand why she died, and discovering that his entire identity is built on a lie could devastate him." He reached out as if to touch her arm, then stopped himself. "Can we find a way to do this that doesn't destroy a little boy's world?" Maya's expression softened slightly as she considered Nathan's words. She'd spent her childhood wondering why her mother had left her, creating elaborate fantasies about Esperanza's reasons and imagining reunion scenarios that never came true. Now she understood that her mother had been a victim, not a villain, but the 8-year-old girl inside her still craved the family connection she'd always been denied. "I need to think," Maya said finally. "I need to talk to my grandmother Carmen. She knew more about this than she let on, and maybe she knows how to find my mother." She gathered her purse and moved toward the door, then paused. "Nathan, I don't blame you for what Helen did. But I can't pretend it didn't happen either. Lucas is my blood, and I've already lost too many years with him." As Maya left the office, Nathan sank back into his chair and stared at the evidence spread across Webb's desk. Every document represented another crack in the foundation of his life, another reason to question the woman he'd loved and mourned. But they also represented hope for Maya, a chance to reclaim the family that had been stolen from her. The question now was whether it was possible to heal one family without destroying another. Webb began gathering the documents, his movements careful and respectful. "Mr. Pierce, I have one more piece of information that might be relevant. I found a record of a large cash withdrawal from Helen's account 3 days after Lucas's birth. $50,000 taken out in a single transaction." He handed Nathan a bank statement. "I believe that was payment to ensure Esperanza Rodriguez stayed gone." Nathan stared at the figure, a sum that had seemed insignificant when he'd glanced at their finances years ago, but now carried the weight of a family's destruction. Helen had not only stolen a child, she'd paid to make sure his mother could never come back for him. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd grieved for 2 years, had been capable of cruelty he couldn't comprehend. But as he left the investigator's office that afternoon, Nathan knew that understanding Helen's actions was less important than dealing with their consequences. Maya was going to find Esperanza Rodriguez, and when she did, Lucas would learn that his entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. The only question was whether Nathan would be there to help pick up the pieces, or whether he would lose his son along with everything else he'd believed to be true. The confrontation Nathan had been dreading arrived sooner than expected. 3 days after the meeting with Webb, Maya appeared at Nathan's front door with an elderly woman whose weathered face held traces of Maya's features. Carmen Rodriguez stood barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled the doorway with decades of suppressed grief and carefully guarded secrets. She looked at Nathan with eyes that held no surprise, as if she'd been expecting this moment for 18 years. "Mr. Pierce," Carmen said, her accent thick with emotion. "It's time we talked about what your wife did to my family." Nathan invited them into his living room, acutely aware that Lucas was upstairs doing homework, blissfully unaware that his world was about to change forever. Carmen settled into Helen's favorite chair with a heavy sigh, while Maya perched nervously on the edge of the sofa. The old woman reached into her purse and withdrew a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These are from Esperanza," Carmen began, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "She's been writing to me for 18 years, sending money when she can, telling me about her life in hiding." She untied the ribbon with trembling fingers. She never stopped looking for her son, never stopped hoping that someday she could come home. Nathan felt the air leave his lungs as he realized the full scope of the tragedy his family had caused. Esperanza Rodriguez hadn't just lost her child, she'd lost her entire life, forced to live as a fugitive because of Helen's actions. "Where is she now?" he asked quietly. "Phoenix," Maya answered before her grandmother could respond. "She's been working as a housekeeper for the same family for 15 years, too afraid to contact anyone from her past because your wife threatened to have her deported if she ever tried to reclaim Lucas." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful suburban street where Nathan had brought his stolen son to build their new life. Carmen opened one of the letters and began to read in Spanish, then translated for Nathan's benefit. She says, "Every night I dream about my son. I wonder if he's happy, if he's healthy, if he knows how much his mother loves him." She wrote this last month, Mr. Pierce, 18 years later, and she's still dreaming about Lucas. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted the heavy silence. Lucas appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar voices and the obvious tension in the room. Nathan's heart clenched as he looked at his son, Maya's brother, and realized that the boy's resemblance to the Rodriguez women was undeniable once you knew what to look for. The same warm brown eyes, the same gentle smile, the same way of tilting his head when he was curious about something. "Dad, who are our visitors?" Lucas asked with the polite curiosity Helen had taught him. His gaze landed on Maya, and his face brightened with recognition. "Maya, are you here for dinner?" Maya's composure cracked as she looked at Lucas, seeing not just the brother she'd searched for, but the little boy who had no idea his entire identity was about to be revealed as a lie. "Hello, Lucas," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Carmen studied Lucas with the intensity of a grandmother memorizing every detail of a grandchild she'd never known existed. "He has Esperanza's eyes," she whispered in Spanish, then switched to English. "And her smile. Dios mío, he looks exactly like she did as a child." Nathan saw the moment Lucas began to understand that something significant was happening. The boy's expression shifted from cheerful curiosity to uncertainty as he picked up on the adult's emotional undercurrents. "Dad, is something wrong?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Nathan knew that whatever he said next would determine not just Lucas's future, but Maya's as well. He could continue the lie, protect the boy from the truth, and hope that Maya would respect his choice. Or he could find the courage to tell Lucas the truth and trust that love would be stronger than deception. "Lucas," Nathan said softly, "come sit down. Maya and Mrs. Rodriguez have something very important to tell you about your family." As his son settled beside him on the couch, Nathan caught Maya's eye and saw his own fear reflected there. They were about to shatter an 8-year-old's understanding of who he was and where he belonged, but they were also about to give him something he'd never known he was missing: a mother who had never stopped loving him and a sister who had never stopped searching for him. Carmen reached into her purse again and pulled out a photograph, a duplicate of the one that had started this journey. But this copy showed more of the image, revealing a young woman holding a sleeping infant, both of them surrounded by the warm light of a hospital room. "Lucas," she said gently, "this is your mama, Esperanza, and this is you, the day you were born." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Lucas's sharp intake of breath as he stared at the photograph, trying to process what he was seeing. Nathan watched his son's face, prepared for tears or anger or confusion, but instead saw something that looked almost like relief. As if, on some deep level, Lucas had always known that there were missing pieces to his story. "She's beautiful," Lucas said simply, his 8-year-old honesty cutting through the complexity of adult emotions. He looked up at Maya with new understanding. "You're my sister, aren't you? That's why I felt like I knew you." Maya burst into tears, reaching out to hug the brother she'd thought was lost forever. Lucas accepted the embrace with the easy affection of childhood, not yet fully comprehending the magnitude of what he'd just learned, but understanding that he was loved by people he'd never known existed. Nathan watched them together and felt his heart break and heal simultaneously, knowing that he was witnessing the first moments of a family being reunited. But he also knew that this was only the beginning. Somewhere in Phoenix, Esperanza Rodriguez was still waiting for news of the son she'd never stopped missing. And here in Millbrook, 2 families were about to discover whether love could overcome the damage that secrets and lies had inflicted over 18 long years. The emotional weight of Lucas's revelation had settled over the Pierce household like a heavy blanket, changing everything in ways both subtle and profound. Nathan had expected his son to struggle with the news about his parentage, but Lucas had adapted with the resilience of childhood, asking practical questions about his other mama and when he might meet her. The boy's easy acceptance only made Nathan's own internal conflict more painful. He was simultaneously proud of Lucas's emotional maturity and terrified of losing him. Maya had thrown herself into the search for Esperanza with renewed vigor, using the information from Carmen's letters to track down her mother's current address and phone number. She'd called Nathan 3 times in the past week, her voice shaking with excitement and fear as she shared updates about her progress. The reunion she'd dreamed about for 18 years was finally within reach, but the reality was more complicated than any fantasy. "I spoke to her," Maya had said during their most recent conversation, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to share the news. "She's been working for a family in Phoenix, cleaning their house and watching their children. She's afraid to come back, Nathan. After all these years, she's still afraid of what Helen might have arranged to keep her away." Nathan had spent sleepless nights grappling with the implications of bringing Esperanza back into Lucas's life. The boy deserved to know his biological mother, but Nathan couldn't ignore the fact that he'd been Lucas's father for 8 years. He'd taught Lucas to ride a bike, helped him with homework, and held him through nightmares about losing Helen. Those years couldn't be erased by the revelation of Lucas's true parentage, but they also couldn't compete with the bond between a mother and child. The decision was made for him when Lucas approached him after breakfast on a Saturday morning, his small face serious with the weight of 8-year-old determination. "Dad, I want to meet my other mama. Maya says she's been missing me my whole life, and I think she must be very sad." He climbed onto Nathan's lap with the easy affection that had characterized their relationship since Helen's death. "Can we go to Phoenix and bring her home?" Nathan looked into Lucas's brown eyes, Esperanza's eyes he now realized, and saw not just a child's request, but a moral imperative. "What if meeting her is confusing, buddy? What if it makes you feel torn between different families?" Nathan asked gently, giving Lucas the opportunity to consider the complexities involved. "Maya explained it to me," Lucas replied, with the matter-of-fact wisdom that sometimes surprised Nathan. "She said families can be bigger than we think they are. I can love you and Helen, and also love my other mama and Maya. Love doesn't run out, does it?" The simplicity of Lucas's logic cut through weeks of Nathan's agonizing. Children, Nathan realized, were often better at accepting love in all its forms than adults who had learned to fear it. "No, buddy," he said, hugging Lucas tighter. "Love doesn't run out." Within hours, Nathan had made arrangements for the 3 of them to fly to Phoenix. Maya had quit 2 of her 3 jobs, finally accepting Nathan's offer to cover her expenses during what she called the most important trip of my life. She'd spent the flight alternating between excitement and terror, clutching Carmen's letters and practicing what she would say to the mother she hadn't seen since she was 8 years old. Esperanza Rodriguez lived in a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of Phoenix, the kind of place that housed families who worked hard for little recognition and even less security. Nathan felt a deep shame as he realized that his wife's actions had condemned this woman to 18 years of exile from her own life. The money Helen had used to pay for Esperanza's silence could have supported her comfortably for decades, but instead it had been used as a tool of separation and fear. Maya knocked on apartment 23 with trembling hands while Nathan held Lucas's hand, both of them recognizing the magnitude of the moment. When the door opened, time seemed to stop. Esperanza Rodriguez stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes moving from Maya's face to Lucas's and back again, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She looked older than her 44 years, her hair streaked with premature grey and her hands weathered by decades of manual labor. But her eyes held the same warmth and intelligence that Nathan saw in both her children. "Mija," Esperanza whispered, reaching out to touch Maya's face as if to confirm she was real. "My little girl, you're so beautiful, so grown up." The reunion between mother and daughter was everything Nathan had hoped it would be, and more painful than he'd expected. Maya collapsed into Esperanza's arms with 18 years of grief and longing, while Esperanza held her daughter and sobbed in Spanish, words of love and apology that needed no translation. Nathan watched from a respectful distance, holding Lucas's hand as the boy witnessed emotions he'd never seen before. When Esperanza finally looked at Lucas, the silence was profound. Mother and son stared at each other across 8 years of separation, each seeing themselves reflected in the other's face. Lucas, with the fearlessness of childhood, stepped forward and held out his hand in the formal greeting Nathan had taught him for meeting adults. "Hello," Lucas said politely. "I'm Lucas. I think you're my mama." Esperanza knelt down to his level, tears streaming down her face as she took his small hand in both of hers. "Sí, mi amor," she whispered. "I am your mama. I have been waiting my whole life to meet you again." What followed was the most beautiful and heartbreaking conversation Nathan had ever witnessed. Lucas, with 8-year-old directness, asked Esperanza about her life, her work, and why she had been away for so long. Esperanza answered with careful honesty, explaining in terms he could understand that sometimes adults make mistakes that separate families, but that love never goes away even when people are apart. "Did you miss me?" Lucas asked with the vulnerability of a child who had learned early that people he loved could disappear. "Every single day," Esperanza replied, pulling him into her arms. "Every single day for 8 years I have missed you and loved you and prayed that you were happy and safe." Nathan felt like an intruder in their reunion, but also like a guardian of something precious. He'd been Lucas's father for 8 years, and watching the boy connect with his biological mother didn't diminish those years. It added new dimensions to Lucas's capacity for love. When Esperanza looked at him over Lucas's head, her expression held no anger, only gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for loving my son and taking care of him. I can see in his eyes that he has been happy." Nathan nodded, unable to trust his voice. They still had difficult conversations ahead about custody and the future, but in that moment, all that mattered was a family being reunited after 18 years of forced separation. Helen's actions had created tremendous pain, but they had also, inadvertently, brought together people who might never have found each other otherwise. As evening settled over Phoenix, the four of them sat around Esperanza's small kitchen table, sharing a meal she had prepared with ingredients Maya had bought at a nearby market. Lucas chattered happily about school and friends and his favorite books, while Esperanza listened with the intensity of someone memorizing every word. Maya translated occasionally when Lucas used expressions Esperanza didn't understand, serving as a bridge between the different worlds her brother had inhabited. "What happens now?" Nathan asked as they prepared to return to their hotel for the night. Esperanza looked at Maya, then at Lucas, then back at Nathan. "Now we figure out how to be a family," she said simply. "All of us together." The flight back to Millbrook 3 days later carried more passengers than it had brought to Phoenix. Esperanza had made the difficult decision to leave her life in Arizona behind and start over in Connecticut, closer to Carmen and the grandchildren she'd never known. Nathan had offered to help her find work and housing, but Esperanza had politely declined anything that felt like charity. She would build her new life the same way she'd survived 18 years of exile, through her own strength and determination. Maya had blossomed during their time in Phoenix, finally seeing herself as part of a family rather than an orphaned survivor. She'd made plans to return to school full-time to finish her nursing degree, supported by both Nathan's offer to pay her tuition and Esperanza's encouragement to pursue the career their separation had interrupted. The 3 generations of Rodriguez women were finally together, ready to reclaim the time that Helen's actions had stolen from them. Lucas had handled the transition with typical 8-year-old adaptability, accepting that he now had 2 families who loved him, rather than questioning why the situation was complicated. He'd asked Nathan if Esperanza and Maya could live in their house, and while Nathan had explained that they needed their own space to rebuild their relationship, he'd promised that they would see each other often. "So I have a dad, and a mama, and a sister, and a great-grandmother," Lucas had summarized during the flight home, counting family members on his fingers. "You have a lot of people who love you?" Nathan had confirmed, realizing that Helen's crime had inadvertently created something beautiful. A family larger and more complex than most, but bound together by love that had survived separation, lies, and 18 years of pain. But as their plane descended toward Connecticut, Nathan knew that the hardest part was still ahead. They would have to navigate custody arrangements, legal complications, and the ongoing process of healing from trauma that had shaped all their lives. Esperanza would have to learn to trust again. Maya would have to forgive the years of separation, and Lucas would have to grow up understanding that his family's love story had been born from someone else's terrible choices. The photograph that had started their journey was now just one of many that documented the Rodriguez family's reunion, but Nathan still carried it in his wallet as a reminder of how secrets could destroy lives, and how truth, no matter how painful, was always the better choice. Helen's legacy would always be complicated, but perhaps it could also become a foundation for something better, a family that chose love over deception and healing over revenge. As they collected their luggage and prepared to start their new life together, Nathan looked at the faces around him and realized that sometimes the most broken things could be rebuilt into something even more beautiful than what had come before. 1 year after the photograph in Nathan's wallet had revealed its secret, the landscape of their lives had transformed in ways none of them could have predicted. The Pierce real estate empire had been quietly dismantled, its assets converted into something that would have horrified the ambitious young man Nathan had once been, but filled the father he'd become with profound satisfaction. The Esperanza Rodriguez Foundation now occupied the building that had once housed Nathan's corporate headquarters, providing legal aid and support services to immigrant families facing separation. Nathan himself had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. The billionaire who had once measured success in quarterly profits now worked as the foundation's director of family reunification, using his business skills and financial resources to repair the kind of damage his own family had once inflicted. He'd kept only enough money to ensure Lucas's education and future security, finding more fulfillment in reuniting separated families than he'd ever found in acquiring properties. Esperanza had not just survived her return to Connecticut. She had flourished. Her 18 years of exile had given her an understanding of displacement and loss that made her invaluable in her work with other immigrant families. She'd become the foundation's lead counselor, helping parents navigate the legal system and providing emotional support to children caught in custody battles. Her English had improved rapidly, but she still spoke to Lucas in Spanish, teaching him about the culture Helen's theft had nearly erased. Maya had completed her nursing degree and secured a position at Millbrook General Hospital, the same hospital where Lucas had been born and her family's nightmare had begun. She'd chosen obstetrics, she said, because she wanted to be there for mothers during the most vulnerable moments of their lives. Her presence in the maternity ward had already prevented 2 custody disputes, her experience making her alert to signs that other staff members might miss. Lucas, now 9 years old, moved between his expanded family with the easy grace of a child who had learned that love multiplied rather than divided when it was shared. He spent weekdays with Nathan, weekends with Esperanza and Maya, and holidays with Carmen, who had moved to a small apartment near the foundation's offices. The boy had become bilingual without effort, switching between English and Spanish depending on which family member he was addressing. The Blue Moon Diner had become an unofficial community center for the families the foundation served, its back room hosting support group meetings and celebration dinners with equal frequency. Maya still worked there part-time, not because she needed the money, but because she'd come to love the sense of community it provided. The photograph that had started everything was now displayed behind the counter, not as a mystery, but as a symbol of hope, proof that separated families could find each other again. Nathan had kept Helen's photograph as well, not in his wallet, but in a small frame on his desk at the foundation. He'd needed months of therapy to work through his feelings about the woman he'd married and the choices she'd made. but he'd eventually reached a place of understanding, if not forgiveness. Helen had been drowning in grief and desperation, and she'd made terrible choices that had hurt innocent people. But those choices had also, inadvertently, brought him the family he'd never known he needed. On a warm afternoon in late spring, Nathan sat in the Foundation's garden, watching Lucas teach Esperanza how to throw a baseball. The boy had inherited Nathan's love of the sport, but Esperanza's natural grace, and he was patiently adjusting his mother's grip on the ball while explaining the mechanics of a proper throw. Maya sat nearby grading nursing school applications, occasionally looking up to cheer when Esperanza managed to get the ball near Lucas's glove. Carmen approached Nathan's bench with 2 glasses of iced tea, settling beside him with the comfortable familiarity they'd developed over months of shared family dinners and Foundation events. At 82, she'd become the grandmother Nathan had never had, offering both Lucas and him the kind of unconditional love that came without conditions or expectations. "Are you happy, Nathan?" she asked in her careful English, watching her great-grandson demonstrate pitching form to her daughter. Nathan considered the question as he'd learned to consider all important things, slowly and with attention to the complexities involved. A year ago, he'd been a wealthy but lonely widower, raising a child who wasn't biologically his own. Today, he was a man of modest means, surrounded by a family that had chosen to love him despite the crimes committed in his name. His life was infinitely more complicated than it had been, but also infinitely richer. "I'm happy," he said finally, meaning it in a way he hadn't been able to mean anything for years. "Are you?" Carmen smiled, her weathered face creasing into lines that spoke of joy rather than sorrow. "My daughter is home. My granddaughter knows who she is. My great-grandson knows where he comes from. See, I am happy." They sat in comfortable silence, watching 3 generations of the Rodriguez family play together in the garden that had been built with money earned through Helen's deception, but was now growing something beautiful and true. Nathan thought about the wallet in his jacket pocket, which now contained 4 photographs instead of 1. Esperanza with baby Lucas, Maya graduating from nursing school, Carmen celebrating her 82nd birthday, and all of them together at the Foundation's first anniversary celebration. Lucas's laughter carried across the garden as Esperanza finally managed to throw the ball directly into his glove. "Did you see that, Dad?" he called to Nathan, his face bright with pride in his mother's achievement. "Mama's getting really good at this." The casual way Lucas used both Dad and Mama without confusion or conflict had taken months to develop, but it now seemed as natural as breathing. The boy had learned that families could be larger and more complex than traditional definitions suggested, and that love could be shared without being diminished. As evening approached and they prepared to head home, Nathan and Lucas to their house, Maya and Esperanza to the apartment they'd shared since returning from Phoenix, and Carmen to her nearby residence, Nathan reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. A single photograph had unraveled years of lies and deception, but it had also revealed something more powerful than any secret: the truth that love, when given freely and without conditions, could heal even the deepest wounds. The Foundation would continue its work, helping other families find their way back to each other. Maya would graduate and begin her career as an advocate for mothers and children. Esperanza would continue building the new life that 18 years of exile hadn't managed to destroy. Lucas would grow up knowing all the adults who loved him, understanding that his story was complicated but ultimately beautiful, and Nathan would continue to carry the photograph that had changed everything, not as evidence of past crimes, but as proof that sometimes the most broken things could be rebuilt into something even stronger than what had existed before. Helen's legacy would always be complicated, but it would also always be a reminder that every choice has consequences that ripple through generations, and that the courage to face the truth could transform lives in ways both terrible and wonderful. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the garden, Lucas ran ahead to hold the gate open for the adults, his small act of courtesy a reflection of the values all his parents had tried to instill in him. He waited patiently as they filed through, then skipped ahead to catch up with Maya, chattering about his plans for the weekend and asking if she thought Mama would like to see his latest art project. Nathan watched his son with the mixture of pride and wonder that fatherhood always brought, but now with an added layer of gratitude for the chance to share that joy with others who loved Lucas just as fiercely. The boy belonged to all of them now, and they belonged to him, bound together not by deception or desperation, but by the simple decision to choose love over fear, truth over comfort, and healing over revenge. The photograph in Nathan's wallet was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a memory to be treasured, the beginning of a story that was still being written by people who had learned that the most beautiful families were often the ones that seemed impossible until they became inevitable.